All right, guys, our next guest is a former UFC welterweight champion. He's a UFC welterweight tournament champion, a UFC Hall of Famer, and he has trained fighters and champions such as Matt Hughes, Tim Sylvia, Jens Pulver, and of course, Robbie Lawler. He is the legend, none other than Pat Miletich, and today's on Submission Radio. Pat, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Oh, I'm doing great, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Pat, it's a brand new year. You know, how was 2014 and how was 2015 so far treating a Hall of Famer like yourself?
Well, 2014 was a good year. I mean, I was very busy, doing broadcasts. We did quite a few broadcasts last year, and a lot of law enforcement and military trainings. I've done that for about 15 years, had my own company doing that, and starting a lot of different ventures, and 2015's probably shaping up to be a heck of a lot busier, actually. We've got, I think, 44 shows scheduled for 2015, already 25 law enforcement and military training seminars scheduled, and opening some businesses. And so I'm running around with my head cut off, so to speak.
Wow, Pat, you're like the Donald Trump of MMA. Now, we want to go back to the start of your career for a second. A lot of people get into fighting for different reasons, whether it's money, fame, competitive nature. We read that you first got into fighting professionally to help pay for your mom's medical bills. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was going to school, going to college, and was, obviously wanting to get a degree and move on with my life. I was competing in wrestling. Still, it was something that football was really my first love, but I ended up going to school and wrestling, actually. So my mother got sick with heart problems and could no longer work. And so since my brothers were all older, had families, moved away, some of them, there was really nobody around to take care of her and help her. And so I decided to quit school and go home, and started working 3 jobs, and just was not satisfied with how my life was shaping up to become, and I still had a lot of competitiveness in my blood, and figured that I would at least give it a shot, and started fighting kickboxing and boxing matches. And then that kind of evolved into, once I saw the first Ultimate Fighting Championship come on TV, I said, wow, this is actually my sport. It's tailor-made for me. And since I had a wrestling background and had already had a head start on a lot of people in terms of trying to become a well-balanced fighter or athlete, in terms of already having grappling experience and the boxing and kickboxing, I thought it was perfect for me. So it luckily worked out well for me, and my mother's actually still alive. She's 80 years old, and so things have worked out pretty well overall.
Awesome. Now we want to talk about obviously your gym and the Miletich Fighting System. It was another thing that you were famous for. When you first put together and started the Miletich Fighting System, what was your mantra and what was your way of being different from all the other gyms that existed at the time?
I don't know. I had, I think, a unique insight into understanding that, number one, I wasn't a world-class wrestler. I was a good wrestler, but I wasn't a world-class wrestler. So I knew I wasn't good enough in that area to win fights based on that alone. And seeing how many other things were out there, having trained in martial arts, the submission games, and the great strikers, whether it be boxing or Muay Thai, I realized pretty quick that I needed to be, good at everything, not great at anything, but good at everything, to be able to find a weakness in somebody. And that, along with, I think, the wrestling mentality of the extreme levels of conditioning that it takes to wrestle, and take that to another level with even the striking and everything else, that one way or another I was going to be able to beat people. But on top of that, I think I snapped my forearm in my first kickboxing match and had to finish the fight with a broken arm. I did it in the first round, lost a decision, and because I had snapped my arm, I got a little bit panicky and got tired during the fight. So I never wanted to lose again because I was tired, no matter what happened. So I had to make my training very extreme. And then I also had a kid that I did not know him, but I was a special guest when I was fighting in the UFC, special guest in the kickboxing event in Chicago, and the kid actually died. His heart literally blew up. But I had climbed in the ring because I knew the kid was in trouble right away when he collapsed. And myself and some volunteer firemen were working on him for 8 minutes before a paramedic. They didn't even have an ambulance there. And
Wow.
by the time the ambulance got there, the kid was dark blue and had already died. He died, while we were working on him, trying to save him. And so I never wanted to, as a coach, have to talk or face somebody's parents, that something horrible had happened to an athlete that I was supposed to be training. Never wanted anything like that to happen. So we set out to make champions, but also make sure that the people that didn't belong in the ring or the cage never got in it. And there was an article that just came out not too long ago, actually, and I said to them, a lot of people thought that I was really not a good person, the way I ran practices and the way fighters who came from out of town to train with us, that couldn't handle the training, left after a day or two. They couldn't deal with it, and that was fine with me because I didn't want those type of people around that didn't belong, and that was my motivation for making sure that that never happened in the ring, or the cage. So that was kind of the way we did things.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Pat, because obviously a lot of people know the gym for having amazing sparring sessions and, like you mentioned, a lot of intense training. Just wondering, it was a room full of champions. Casper mentioned some of the guys in the camp. What was it like when it came time to spar and it was, for example, 5:30? What was the atmosphere like in the room? And what was it like, to see these guys who really were the best of the time, going at it, every day sparring? What was that situation like?
Well, it was, I would say it was very similar to my days wrestling. My teammates on the wrestling team, my teammates on the wrestling team were, some of my absolute best friends in life. But when we were in the wrestling ring training with each other, we had no problem, pounding each other into the mat. And if you had a bad day or you didn't keep up the pace, you really got it put on you. And it was the same way on sparring night or any other night, really, in our gym. And I always woke up for well over a decade on Wednesday mornings with a huge smile on my face because it was sparring night. I absolutely loved getting after it and sparring hard. And I think most of the other guys really, really loved it also. Some people said that they dreaded Wednesdays, but I, on the other hand, relished the thought of going at it for 12 or 15 rounds and there's nothing better than being young, healthy, and in shape and going at it like that. It's a blast.
Yeah, we read a lot of stories from a lot of the guys, like Tim Sylvia and I want to say Jens Pulver, and they're talking about how I think sparring was like around 5 or 5:30, and from about 3 o'clock, your heart was pumping, and they'd be watching the clock and things like that. I wanted to ask you, a lot of guys that we speak to, everyone, and just you see it on the countdowns and everything like that, they always talk about training and training smart and less is more and this and that. I'm just wondering, with that whole less is more approach, can you tell us your views on training and sparring, and if those same methods that you use to make those champions, if they still remain applicable in today's training?
Yeah, nothing replaces hard work. I don't care what anybody says. Now, obviously, it was my job to get fighters to their events healthy. And I think I had a pretty solid record when it came to that, getting guys to fights healthy. And so that the train smart and less is more, in my mind, is garbage, because you don't become a Formula One race car driver by getting in a sedan and driving down the highway at 65 miles an hour. Those guys have to go through a lot and work their way up to that level, driving hard and driving fast. And that's the same for fighting. You don't get fight reaction. You don't get endurance to that level unless you train at that level. So the practices, the training had to be more intense and harder than any fight ever could be. So in my mind, that's the way it had to be. Now, our sparring was not with MMA gloves. It was with 16-ounce gloves, headgear, shin pads, all geared up and protected so that we could go hard. Did people still get knocked out now and then? Yes. But, most of the time guys remained healthy. They were exhausted at the end of the training, but we got people to fights healthy. So, AKA does a great job with King Velasquez and all the other guys that they've got over there, the Daniel Cormiers and everything. They train that way over there, I know, and that's why they have so many good guys is because they train that way. And so, it's just, to me, in my mind, the people that are going to be successful are the ones that work harder than everybody else.
Very well said, Pat. Now, let's get back to your career. From a young age, you always wanted to be a champion. You mentioned before you didn't want to be ordinary. And, in 1998, when you defeated Mikey Burnett to become the first ever UFC welterweight champion, what was it like becoming the champion? And, how did you feel when you realized, you fulfilled a dream like that, as becoming a UFC champion?
Actually, I think, winning the 4-man tournament was, in my mind, becoming the champion. So the Brazil fight was more, even though they gave the belt at that point, it was still, in my mind, defense of the title because Mikey had dropped out of the tournament after his first fight. So it definitely was, the realization of a dream, a goal, and I thought that by winning that title that, everything was going to be peaches and cream after that. But, once you win the title, then you have to defend it. And suddenly, the bullseye that you had on everybody else, like when I was coming up boxing and had to fight a guy for a United States championship, everybody had the bullseye on his back, and I was the hungry one coming up. So once you have the belt, now the bullseye's around, on your back, and every fighter on the planet at your weight is wanting to beat you. They're training specifically to beat you. So that's, a whole new level of pressure comes about and responsibility also, because a lot of eyes are on you.
It's interesting that you say that, Pat, because we wanted to touch on that. You mentioned how the Brazil win was sort of bigger, winning the welterweight tournament. Oleg Taktarov, another MMA legend and a UFC tournament winner, recently mentioned how he believes the real Ultimate Fighting Championship died in the 90s because back then there were fewer rules, you had no rounds, the weight differences were much bigger, and guys had to fight obviously multiple times in one night. And Oleg also mentioned that nowadays one fight is just a fight. As a former UFC tournament winner yourself, what are your thoughts on these comments, and do you think there's any truth to those statements?
I think to a certain extent there is some truth to that because fighting in tournaments, I had fought in 3 tournaments before I started, doing single fights only. But the tournament aspect of things is, I tell you what, man, it's a blast, but a ton of pressure. You're watching the guys fight on the other side of the bracket and figuring out how you're going to beat them while you're getting ready for a fight, and fighting 3 fights in one night for 2 of my tournaments against guys that were much bigger. There's a lot of strategy involved in that. So, and also, do you go out and try and conserve energy and stay healthy and just win? Or because, back then in the first 2 tournaments I fought in, there were no weight divisions, no time limits. None of that. So, and I was smaller than everybody else. So I said to myself, I've got to go out and try and, dispatch of these guys as quickly as I can so that I'm fresh for the next round. And it worked out that way. I was able to beat guys pretty quickly. And the other guys were having wars on the other side of the bracket, 20 and 30-minute fights. And it helped me considerably.
Now, when you were champion in the UFC, it was very much a growing period for the sport, Pat. In fact, the sport is still growing now, but, with the Fox deal and the Reebok deal and in general, the sport is blowing up. What do you think about the sport and where it's headed? And did you ever think that it would get as big as it is now?
I knew it would. I knew it was going to explode eventually once the people out there, the public, were educated as to what, level of dedication, of endurance and technical knowledge goes into becoming an athlete in the sport. So I knew it was headed to big things, but I wasn't sure exactly when it was going to happen. In terms of where the sport's headed right now, with this UFC lawsuit that's come about, I think that could change the sport's complexion in a big way. By changing the contracts so that athletes truly are, if you're an independent contractor, well, you're going to go to the highest bidder. And so the contracts in MMA are pretty restrictive. And you don't see those type of contracts in any other sport. They just do not exist. They get laughed out of any other professional sports negotiating. They just wouldn't be accepted. So that's going to change the complexion of the sport. And I think that you're going to see a lot more people with a lot of money get involved in the sport because of that, if this lawsuit, ends up, doing something with the contracts.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we wanted to get your thoughts on, Pat. I'm just wondering, if you're going to get involved in the lawsuit in some capacity, and also just, for all the listeners out there, and to be honest, ourselves as well, just in layman terms, sort of explain what exactly is it about, and just in general, you mentioned before about, how the contracts would be laughed out of any sport. What exactly is it about the contracts that you think just shouldn't apply to MMA?
Well, it's in terms of the contracts. It's a situation where, one organization having a great deal of power and making you sign a contract that includes signing away your likeness and the rights to that likeness for as long as the company wants to use it. Things like that. The Champions Clause, where if I have a belt underneath an organization, I can't walk and look for, at the end of my contract, if I'm a champion, there's always another fight that I have to fulfill, no matter what. And there's a few other things in the contract that, I haven't looked at one of them for a long time, but I'm assuming for the most part that they're similar to that. And a lot of the guys that have complained about it of late who are still athletes, will concur with some of those things. So that's, the restrictive nature of the contracts are pretty tough to deal with, I think, for the athletes. And also on top of that, not being able to get the sponsors that you want, unless those sponsors pay a fee to the promoter or the promotion before they can sponsor athletes, and it goes on down the line. So it makes it tough for the athletes. You have to figure, if I'm getting whatever it is now, 8,000 to show up in any organization. My medicals cost quite a bit of money to go through. I have to pay my manager. I have to pay my trainers. I have to pay taxes. So by the time I get done getting paid, I actually might be in the hole a little bit. So it's pretty tough. And on top of that, now with restricting, sponsors, very tough for the guys trying to come up and break into the upper ranks.
Now, Pat, Randy Couture was on the show last week, and we were talking about this lawsuit situation. And one of the things we sort of spoke about is, and I'd love your opinion on it, is do you think that this lawsuit could be sort of the embryonic stage of a MMA fighters union coming together now that fighters are sort of seeing other fighters, stand up for certain issues like contracts and other things happening in the sport? And if an MMA union does happen, is that something that you would welcome to the sport?
I think a union is very tough to pull off because of the independent contractor status of the athletes. It's not like they are members of a team that pays them as they do in baseball and football and things like that. So it's very difficult to do that. What are the union fees going to be? And when guys are only fighting, 4 times a year, 3 times a year, some 2 times a year, how do you work that out? What are the benefits of it? I'm not necessarily a guy that would support a fighters union. If the contracts are adjusted to be more fair to the athletes and give them more power in their future and their direction of their career, I think that's sufficient. I mean, I'm a guy that is a big believer in the free market system, and the guys that perform the best get paid the most and put butts in seats. That's really what it comes down to. So not necessarily a guy that supports a fighters union, and on top of that, it'd be very tough to pull off.
All right, well, let's talk about, one of the more famous fighters and products of the Miletich system, Robbie Lawler. He recently became the UFC Welterweight Champion. It's rather crazy to see Robbie not only have such a big career resurgence over the last few years, but win the big one on the biggest stage. As a coach, what do you think the main reason is for Robbie being able to stay relevant and so good after so many years in MMA?
I think that, the main thing is Robbie, when he trains very hard, and he's got good work ethic. He's an exceptional athlete. He's very smart. He's very observant. He watches the sport. He watches boxing. He watches kickboxing, and he studies things. He's generally a pretty quiet guy, but he's always thinking, and that's something. But the fact that he, having been at 185 pounds for quite a while after his first UFC stint, and it's not like anybody at 185 pounds just came out and ran him over. And you got to remember, those guys are cutting down from 230 pounds, some of them. He was fighting guys that were naturally much bigger than him and beating some of them. And nobody, like I said, any of the world-class guys were just coming out and running him over. So I knew, and, myself and several other people were in his ear for all those years saying, you need to drop back down to 170. That's where you belong, and go in and make a run and win a world title and take care of yourself and your family. And, once he made that decision to drop down to 170 and got signed by the UFC, I pretty much knew that he was going to wreak havoc on that division. A lot of people laughed at me publicly in the media, on Twitter, on Facebook. Lawler's going to get killed by Josh Koscheck. He's going to get destroyed by this guy, by that guy. And, he went in and did his work and now finally has that belt. So I'm really happy for him.
Now, Pat, there seems to be a lot of mystique about Robbie in the gym because, there are times where he didn't spar for a while. Also, we heard, and this is a rumor, that he was a little bit defined back in the day. Can you tell us, what was it like training with a practically, he was very, very young, a very, very young version of Robbie Lawler back in the day at the Miletich Fighting System?
He wasn't defiant really at all. On the other hand, he was a guy that depending on who the person was, and for the most part, you never really wanted to just come out and say, this is what you're going to do. If simply asked, which I'd done several times, what do you think you need to work on? Robbie would tell me what he thought he needed to work on, and he was pretty much always on target with that, and that's the stuff we would work on. To give you an example, one time when he was sparring, Tim Sylvia was standing off to the side watching him spar, and Rob didn't have his hands up high. And Tim Sylvia said, "Robbie, get your hands up." And so Rob looked over at Tim, dropped his hands down to his side, and finished the round like that for a minute, and basically let Tim know what he thought of his advice. And Tim said it again a couple of rounds later, and he did it again, and I just said, "Tim, shut up. leave him alone. He knows what he's doing." And so that's just kind of the way Rob was.
Yeah, and you mentioned before when Robbie was obviously fighting middleweight in Strikeforce, and people laughing when the Josh Koscheck got announced. You've obviously been close for a number of years. In all honesty, going back around 2011 when Robbie had those few tough losses in Strikeforce, did you ever envision him becoming a champion? In the UFC?
Yeah, and I wanted that really bad too. It's a guy that started training with me when he was 16 years old or so. So he was a guy that I really liked having around, and he was a guy that was liked by everybody on the team. Everybody saw him like a little brother, back in those days. And so no, I knew he could. If he dropped to 170, I knew he could beat anybody on the planet. And I think at the time George St. Pierre was the champion, and I told people, and a lot of people laughed at me about that, but I said Robbie Lawler is the worst possible matchup for George St. Pierre. Robbie will absolutely wreck him. And now obviously we didn't get to find out about that matchup because George has stepped away for a while, or maybe for good, we don't know. But Robbie's a bad matchup for almost anybody because of his skill set and how dangerous he is and how hard he hits.
I'd love to hear, Pat, when you say he's the worst possible matchup for GSP, just from a coach's standpoint, are you able to elaborate a little bit more on that and, why you think he would be such a bad matchup for GSP?
George, was a guy that is very good at the transition game, very good at making people think they're in a boxing match and hitting takedowns when people least expect it. Very good at holding people down. Very good at controlling people, and pretty dang good with his jab and setting stuff up off of that jab. But Robbie's a much more refined striker than George is. He hits much harder. And George certainly would not be able to hold Rob down and ride out a decision. It just wouldn't happen. So that's given those two things. It would not be a good matchup for George, period.
Very interesting, Pat. Now, we read a quote of yours recently, which was, I made it a point to always tell people if you truly care about your training partners and your teammates, you will kick their ass. Can you explain your philosophy to us? And also, what do you think when you hear about the fighters like Rory McDonald versus GSP and Tyron Woodley versus Hector Lombard not being made because of being teammates and not wanting to fight each other? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in the training room, it's my job to make my training partners better by putting it on them. And I went through the days where I got my butt handed to me in the room, and it made me better because I got motivated. I was motivated. I trained harder because of it, because I did not want to have people get over on me in the training room, which then translates into wins in actual fights. It doesn't go to the level of being malicious when you put it on somebody. If you hurt someone in a training session, with a good kick or a good punch or something, you're not going to try and then knock them completely unconscious. You're going to back off. But up until that point, I'm going to put it on someone as hard as I possibly can. That's just the way it is, and that's the way it's always been for me and for any of the guys that always trained with me. And they had no problem. I mean, the first time that I ever got dropped in my gym was Jeremy Horn hit me with a body shot and dropped me. And he ran around the room. The whole room stopped. All my fighters stopped. And they were all high-fiving Jeremy because he, somebody dropped me. And, and I laid there. I had the wind knocked out of me and got up laughing and said, hey, great shot. Let's go back after it because I'm going to try and do the same thing back at you. So it's the way it should be.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, Pat, we mentioned Tim Sylvia a bit throughout the interview. He's one of your more famous students, and he recently retired. It's a bit of a shame because I believe it was commission-related also. Do you think it was the right time for Tim to retire, or do you think he had given enough to the sport, or do you think he had more to do in MMA?
I think that, things happen for a reason. An MRI came back that showed some abnormalities in his brain, and that's never a good thing. And his weight had ballooned up quite a bit. He's 370 pounds, which he obviously should not be at that weight. He should be walking around, no more than 300 pounds, and even less in my mind, for him to remain healthy throughout life, probably, But, the injuries that a guy sustains over all the years, and the bigger guys are more susceptible, to the lower back problems, the hips, the knees, the feet, all those sort of things. And so it gets, as you get older, it gets harder and harder to work the weight off. And especially when you're beat up, banged up, your lower extremities, you can't you can't go out and do road work. You can't do the things that you used to do to burn the calories. And so, once you get to that point, obviously it's probably a good idea to hang it up.
Now, Pat, we're going to ask you a couple of fan questions. When fans knew you were coming into the show, they sent through some questions, so we picked out a couple to ask you. And the first one comes from MMA Shooters. He wants to know what's your thought about this whole John Jones situation and recreational drugs in MMA in general. Do you think that they affect performance, and do you think that they could become an issue in the sport?
I was very surprised that he tested positive for cocaine. I mean, cocaine is such a destructive drug and such a nasty addiction that people can get into. I've not seen it amongst a lot of athletes, and certainly not guys that are good at MMA. It's such a bad drug that I'm shocked that someone who's that good an athlete and able to perform at that level is doing it. I don't know how much he did it, but that's number one. Number two, who are John Jones's handlers that allowing him to hang out with people that are giving him cocaine at whether it's parties or wherever the hell he's at in the first place. And so that's another thing that people who are around him that realize there's a problem need to say, listen, you need to maybe look into getting, different representation, hanging out with a different group of people. And, that's something that has to come about. And so you never want to be surrounded by a bunch of yes men. And I think I was lucky in that aspect, where the friends that I had, that I hung out with, if I ever did anything that was going to be a mistake and detrimental to my life, they had no problem calling me out on it. And that's a true friend, somebody that's going to get in your face and say, listen, you might be the world champ, but you're screwing up your life right now, and you need to wake up. And that's important. So I think that some of those people out there that are around John need to evaluate, what people in that group need to go. And so that's probably the first thing.
Now I got another fan question from B Head. He wants to know after the Robbie Lawler fight, there was an iconic shot of you, Matt Hughes, the former welterweight champion, then the legend, and the Robbie Lawler and the old Miletich crew celebrating. What was it like for you to be a part of that moment, and also having another one of your guys hold the belt after the Robbie Lawler fight?
It was nice. It was nice. I understood the significance of it, right away. To kind of let you know, give you a little bit of background on that. When Rob was training with us for probably a couple of years, by the time he was, 18 years old, I mean, he was in sparring, he was beating the hell out of world champions at 18 already. And in the room, he was a different guy. In fights at that age, he would go out with reckless abandon, but in the room, he would absolutely pick you apart, and was very composed in the room. And one day after grappling session, Matt Hughes had really kicked my butt one day, and I at that time had the UFC title, and I sat down on a bench in the locker room, and Matt sat down on another bench, and then there was another bench behind Matt that Robbie was sitting on. And Matt said, hey, old man, you better stay on your toes, because I'm breathing right down your neck, and I'm coming for you. And it was a way of saying, your time's about up, and I'm going to be the next champ. And I understood it as that. But what Matt didn't realize is who was sitting behind him. And I said, yeah, well, while I'm looking over my shoulder at you, you might want to look over your shoulder. And he turned around and saw Rob sitting there, and Matt turned back toward me and started laughing. He goes, all right, I know exactly what you're saying. So.
Wow. And imagine just someone being in that room, a photographer, and getting a photo at that stage. That would have just been an amazing picture. Now, we have another question here from Zombie Lawler. That's a really interesting username. He'd like to know, you and Carlos Newton were supposed to coach the Ultimate Fighter 3 originally instead of Ken and Tito. Now, how close were you to doing tough, and what exactly happened to stop that from happening?
Well, I was on a movie set down in Mexico, a Paul Walker film, actually. And the director, John Hirschfeld, who's a really good friend of mine, got a phone call and said, Pat, I got somebody on the cell phone here that wants to talk to you. So I walked over to him. We're in the desert in Baja, Mexico, and walked over and took the phone from him. It was Dana White, and he said, hey, I'm just wondering if you'd say yes if I made you and Carlos Newton coaches of the next Ultimate Fighter. I said, yeah, sure, I'd love to. And he goes, okay. And Matt Hughes was fighting, I believe, that night. And so the whole crew from the movie, a bunch of the actors, Lawrence Fishburne, Paul Walker, the Carradine brothers, John Hirschfeld, the director, myself, and some of the other fighters, Rob Lawler was one of them, Roy Markham, Tim Sylvia, Chuck Liddell, Dan McGee. A bunch of us went over to a golf resort, and they hooked up the pay-per-view for us so we could watch Matt Hughes fight Joe Riggs. And we were missing Matt's fight, and so we at least wanted to be able to see him fight. And Dana White climbed in the cage during that show and said, grabbed the microphone and said, I want to announce the fighters for the next season of The Ultimate Fighter. And I said, wow, he's going to announce it. Okay, cool. And he announced Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz, and everybody in the room turned around and looked at me with disbelief going, wow, you just got shafted hard. And, it's pretty bad. I got blindsided pretty bad on that one. Dana has since, apologized for that, and everything's good with us. I don't have a problem with it. But at the time, it was not a pleasant experience. I can tell you, because, definitely a surprise.
Yeah, no, I can only imagine. And the last fan question is from Duckshot3. Now, we feel like we could maybe guess this one, but you never know. There's so many killers in the gym. He wants to know, who was the hardest hitter back in the day that you trained?
The two hardest punchers I ever trained were Rob Lawler and a guy by the name of Drew McFedries. Many people will remember him from the UFC days, and he beat Alessio Sakara and some other guys. Drew was probably the best athlete that I ever had, but he had a rough road with Crohn's disease and did not absorb the nutrients from his food into his body, and really ran into a lot of problems because of that, with endurance and a lot of other stuff. And it was too bad, because he was just a scary guy when it came to striking. Just would dismantle people, and 16-ounce gloves and headgear did not help you with Drew McFedries. He would put you to sleep either way.
Wow.
It was kind of a bummer, him getting sidelined with the Crohn's disease and everything else that he had gone through. He had a pretty tough road.
Now, Pat, what we're going to do now is a fun little thing we like to finish our interviews with, called the Submission Radio Tap Out Round. We throw some really fun questions at you, and you answer with the first thing that comes to mind. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right, here we go. Now, what did it feel like when you got inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame?
Wow, the first thing that comes to mind, surprised.
What's your favorite technique that you've always taught your guys?
Footwork.
You're a great coach yourself. What's the best advice you've ever received from a coach?
Don't pay attention to keeping your office neat. Your focus should be on your athlete.
Pat, if you could go back in time on the condition that you could only either be a coach or be a fighter, which one would you choose?
I'd be a fighter.
Now, July is a while away in 2015, but who do you think should be the next inductee into the UFC Hall of Fame, in your opinion?
Boss Rutan.
Oh, Bass is awesome. Now, you spent a lot of time there. Do you miss Strikeforce?
I do miss Strikeforce. I loved Strikeforce.
Finish the sentence for us, Pat. People don't know that I
love the golf.
Now, Pat, if you could train anyone today in the sport that you haven't yet trained, who would it be?
Tyron Woodley.
And finally, Pat, what do you want people to remember most when they think about Pat Miletich 100 years down the track?
Ew, boy, that's a rough one. Love the fans. How's that?
Loving the fans. Hey, can't argue with that. Pat, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today. Guys, don't forget to check out Pat Miletich on Twitter at Pat Miletich. And, of course, the website firehorsecombatives.com. Obviously, Pat does a lot of training with the military and I believe police officers and things like that. Pat, it's been such a pleasure having on your show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And hopefully someday Australia is one of the few places on the planet I've never been. So I'd love to make it there someday.